Thank you for listening to the Allender Center podcast. I'm Dr. Dan Allender.
And I'm Rachael Clinton Chen. We're fiercely committed to providing hope and healing to a fragmented world.
And restoration for the heart.
Thank you for joining us. Let's get this conversation started.
Rachael, this is our last podcast for the inglorious year 2020. And before we go into what we want to talk about, let me just say, I hope it was a Merry Christmas. And let me just say Merry Christmas to you.
Yeah, and you as well.
What a season. What a crazy season it has been. But we can say, look, this whole year, 2020, has been nothing compared to what any of us would have thought would be true starting in January 1st on 2020. But look, as we end the year, we know it's a very artificial process to complete a year and start another year because, look, it's just one day difference. But nonetheless, I think it is one of those times that is so wise to look back and to, in some sense, take in as much as we can at the end of the year as to what the process was. What are we to become and learn and engage as a result of having lived, at least for my 68 years, one of the most tumultuous years I've ever lived on this earth. So as we begin to reflect on this, before we even jump in, I'd love to know from your perspective, what is the gain in remembering a year?
Well, I mean, when I think about just the very act of remembering, we see a lot even in the biblical text that tells us to remember. And obviously, it's a lot more fun to remember years that bear a lot more goodness, like maybe more goodness and abundance than despair and sorrow. And yet, there is a lot of power in remembering, and especially in taking stock, like in remembering in a kind of way that there is some discernment or wisdom involved. Because I do think there's something, even if it's some way we're bound to our own human time, that these cycles of, ending and beginning give us an opportunity both to remember our Ebenezers, or those places where beyond all possibility, God showed up and was faithful to provide, faithful to be with, to comfort, faithful to even invite us into a kind of repentance that brings about the possibility of new life. And I think there's also a power in remembering where things didn't go well. And what we learn through suffering and what it reveals to us. And this was such a revelatory year. Like, it's kind of like if we don't pause to take a look back, I think we really miss an opportunity as we move into the season ahead.
Yeah, we cannot move into the future with any sense of true biblical hope if we've not allowed ourselves to engage the past. It's been said 1 trillion times, we are doomed to repeat the past if we don't engage it. And so in some sense, I don't want to repeat 2020, or in some ways, the unique particularity of my own life. There are things that I am thrilled by, things I'm heartbroken by, but I've got to be willing to sort through the year. And that's not going to happen by hearing a podcast. We can prompt you, but you, listener, have to be willing to do the work. And I'm curious, Rachael, how you go about at the end of the year to do the work.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of funny because my birthday is the beginning of December. And so in some ways, I'm like, everyone else can do this on January 1st, but since my birthday is so close to the new year, I'm going to kind of let that be the time I pause and reflect and think about. So in some ways, I've been doing this now for a couple of months, but for me, my husband and I, we were actually sitting down to tell a lot of stories, like kind of going back to the calendar, looking at different events that were taking place. I mean, this was our first year of marriage. Like, I mean, yes, technically a little bit in 2019, but really just 2 months. So 2020 is our first year of marriage. And so going back through and telling the stories of this year, both the really stunning and kind of, remember when we did that, this thing we did, this trip we took, but remember this huge decision you were making? My husband applied to PhD programs. So again, like going through and telling the stories. And it was really powerful to do together because obviously there are different things we remember based on how it impacts us. So really setting aside time to reflect. And for some people, I know they like to journal. Like some people like to do that by spending some time actually writing down. I think for me in this particular season, it was really powerful to be able to do that with someone who, whether they wanted to or not, actually spent a lot of life with me this year. Like 24/7.
We are going to remember whether you want to or not. Well, and for us, we pick a time where we separately calendar. I have it on my phone, a Google Calendar, and literally I go day to day. And the day may not be absolutely clear what happened, but sometimes the meetings bring back, oh my God, that's when X occurred. Oh my, or oh yes, that was such a sweet moment. A lot of it is just blank calendar. I know what I was doing and I have no clue, but usually I'll have 20 to 30 events that the calendar prompts. And now that process of thinking through, well, what happened there? This is where, again, the problem with memory is that the heightened level of cortisol, meaning the heightened level usually of threat or danger, tends to either have so much cortisol that you don't remember without fragmentation, or so little sense of danger that there's not enough cortisol to actually form enough of a memory to be able to recall. So a lot of it is coming back into the fact that a lot of my life is quite boring. Boring enough that I don't remember it. And other portions so traumatic that I don't really remember it that much to begin with. So it's a hard process to sort through the tedium and the trauma on both ends. And so to then begin to talk with Becky, that's kind of our next stage of, just as you and Michael begin to sort of share the experience, and particularly if it was shared together. It is wild to hear that she was part of the same event, and we see it still to this day. Very, very. So, I mean, from all that, I eventually come down to trying to answer 3 questions.
Yeah.
What haunts me? What comforts me? What thrills me? And if I could come, and there was a lot this year that was haunting, from George Floyd's death to the way COVID-19 was addressed in our country. I mean, what haunts, what comforts, what thrills? And they're just ways to try and find categories to maybe on the border of systematizing, but coming just to one moment that I can hold, especially before the face of God, to ponder in the way. So do you find similarity to that?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, so something that Michael loves to do is life mapping. And I don't know if you're familiar with life mapping, but it's just a visual way of basically doing what you're doing, where you take a big poster board and post-it notes. And it's a very similar, like, yeah, what event? Usually you're doing it for your whole life, but we've talked about doing it just for like a year in your life. Like, what events? It's really asking, what are the shaping events, and then putting them into categories, right? So very similar, like, what events shaped you in a way that you know was really painful and hard? What events shaped you in a way that were pretty glorious and powerful? And then what events you know had impact, but maybe you're not quite sure yet, like the full scale of that impact. Or so it's a similar, but I like these questions: what haunts you, what comforts you, what thrills you from remembering and reflecting on this time. And
well,
so
I'm curious, let's go through at least a little bit of our own year. What haunted you? And again, the problem with that is, whatever you say, there's 100 other hauntings, which is not to minimize the other 99. It's simply to say that whatever stays with you doesn't have to be the worst, but it's something that you can truly say unnerved you. Mm-hmm. What was haunting?
Oh my gosh. I mean, in some ways, I want to be like, 2020 is a year that will haunt me. Like, it's so haunting. I've had a little bit of a head start to ponder these questions, and this might feel too meta, and I don't mean to. It's not abstracted for me. It's some way. It's a way to talk about the haunting that will connect all the pieces. But I think this year was so apocalyptic in its revelation and its exposure of our systems, and how much disparity, how much, I think, feeling so naive. And I'm a pretty wise person, I would say. Like, I know most people don't call themselves wise if they're actually wise, but I would say I'm someone who seeks to pursue wisdom even over and above knowledge. And I feel like this is a year that will haunt me in what it exposed. Not that anything I felt like, oh, I didn't see this before, but I didn't see the extent. And I just didn't think, in some ways, I didn't think we were where we are. So when it comes to police brutality against Black and brown bodies, when it comes to the way our healthcare system is not accessible to so many, the ways in which our fear has called all of us into disinformation, and choosing which information kind of sets up our place in this world. I think I will forever be haunted by the ache, by watching my children go to virtual school and not be able to see their friends at a really pivotal developmental time in their life haunts me. So I think for me, there's so much both that is exposing and revealing systems that have been in place. And then there's a kind of haunting of, like, there's also new trauma playing out that's compounding old trauma. And we don't know yet the impact because we're still in it. And that is very haunting as a trauma specialist, to be in a trauma moment, a collective trauma moment, and not yet know what the impact will be for many years to come.
I don't know what to say beyond yes and yes. Everything that you said, I feel like I can ditto. And what I would add is masks haunt me. There's something about the warfare over a good portion of America resenting the wearing to a point where it becomes the claim of freedom, opposing tyranny, standing for what's true in the Constitution by being able to inflict and infect other human beings. I couldn't be more haunted by the reality of how we got to this politicized and polarized place with regard to I want to care for you. And yet, just yesterday, we saw my daughter and her husband and her two daughters, and Parker, our youngest granddaughter, was born early in January. And, we spent the first 5 weeks of her life with them, caring for our granddaughter, and then COVID hit. And since that day, whenever we've been with them, I wear a mask, of course. And, every time I see my granddaughter, 6 feet difference, and I have my mask on, she doesn't know who I am. And, and then when I remove my mask, stepping back even a few more feet, and there's this, you can see this sort of this slight awareness that she knows this face, but it's clear I'm still a foreigner to her. And it's to feel like a foreigner in your own country, to feel like a stranger to your own granddaughter, to be haunted by the metaphor, the symbol of a mask. I wear a mask, and I will wear a mask probably through 2021. But the bottom line is, I would never have thought that we would have been in war through and because of a mask in the way that we are.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, let me ask you again. So, in the middle of all that, what has brought comfort?
Oh man, I actually love this question because I would say two things come to mind. One feels much larger, and one feels like really just like in the particularity of my home. But one thing I would say is I agree with you, Dan. That is something that has haunted me as well. Our incapacity to take even a simple measure, no matter what you feel about it, to love our neighbors. But I think what also comforts me is in the midst of that horror, also being continually reminded of the ways people who can find a way to love in profound ways in moments of deprivation and horror, to see people love well, to come together, to practice social distancing, to support small businesses, to give food to neighbors and pour out food to food banks because people are needing more food. And the ways in which I often experience this from people who have the least and give the most, and how that gives me a sign that God has not abandoned us. I think the other thing I would say is this being my first year of marriage, and I hold this, in some ways it's hard to talk about. I almost feel guilty in a year where people are socially distanced, and especially where my singleness is still so close, and the memories of that and the lack of touch, even in just a regular year. But what has comforted me is to have a companion, to have children that even in their weird year still needed someone to show up and just be with them and play board games and watch movie marathons, and to have a spouse who is very kind and very tender, and the comfort we have in just being near each other. I do, again, think we're made for touch. We're made for care. We're made for kindness. We're made for connection. And this has been a year in the midst of all of the things where I have experienced a kind of abundance of those things that I honestly never thought I would know. And that has brought me a tremendous amount of comfort. In fact, it's brought me a lot of oxytocin too, because a little bit of me, I'm like, I should have had about 72 nervous breakdowns by now. And don't get me wrong, I've come close and I've had some. I just feel like
72.
What about you?
Oh, well, what comes to mind, honestly, is I watch, not every night, but pretty much every night, David Muir on ABC National News. And toward the very end, often he has some amazing people who are doing things for other human beings that I have, in the middle of my own and other people's trauma, as much as I may invite people to grieve, it's not easy for me to let my body and heart come to tears. And I think when you spend a lot of your day and week and month engaging other people's grief, it's a reservoir that at times I fear entering. And yet I need prompts. I have 100 every day, but there's something. I like David Muir, and there's something about his tenderness. And when he tells the story or allows it to be played, I would say about on Seattle time at about 5 till 6 every night, I cry. Not every night, but a lot. And I find out when I'm working out on a recently purchased piece of athletic equipment, I cry. There are 3 or 4 times, often a day, that tears will come. Sometimes for 5 or 10 minutes, sometimes just for seconds. But I think that sense of how odd that David Muir, I don't know him and we'll never meet him, but nonetheless, there is something about his presence that is mediated for me in the face of Jesus. And I need countless encounters with people who mediate Jesus to me. And so I have found my heart comforted. Like when my father died almost 25 years ago, I remember thinking, I'm going to grieve. I'm going to grieve. And the first couple of weeks, of course, I was heartsick, but there were very few tears. And then over the next 6 months to a year, tears would come at the most unpredictable moments. And most people who know grief know what I'm putting words to. So in that sense, that there has been comfort at all. And through odd context and situations, it just reminds me again, Jesus is humble enough to use even a braying ass like me to bring comfort. He can use anyone and anything to bring good taste of comfort. So
thanks be to God. Thanks be to God.
So, what thrills you as you think about this year?
I'm not going to lie. This was a really hard one.
Yeah.
The thrill. I think the most honest answer I have for you is that I don't think God does this. Okay. I think in seasons like this, we have an opportunity to be disrupted in ways that bring about the kingdom of God in the ways it's most meant to be manifested on this earth. That the Spirit maybe has a little more room to move in our lives because we are so aware of how much we are in need of God. We're closer to the dirt. So there's something I wouldn't say, I'm not like, and God brought this about so that I think that's clear. I've been pretty clear about my thoughts around this kind of suffering. And I do believe that God is faithful to bring beauty from our ashes. So when I think about the possibilities of some of the questions we'll go into around like, what do we leave behind? What do we take with us? I feel a slight sense of thrill. It's like real close to trepidation, but that's kind of the nature of thrill, isn't it? I do think seeing what, I'm going to just stop there because that's the best honest answer I can have today.
That's good. And again, we both know you're way more mature than me because even what you put words to is closer to what I believe is best. But if I'm answering the question honestly, I was fishing with my dear friend Steve Call, and we literally ran into two friends I've not seen for years on the same side of the river. And we are deep, deep in the wilderness in Montana. You don't run into people you know. So we're sitting around this pool, and I put a fly on. But we're in conversation, and I sort of dabbed it out into this little pool, and this ferocious, beautiful trout went after it, and literally sitting on a rock, hardly paying attention. Out of nowhere came this sweet fish. All I can tell you is it is surprise. Things that I would never have predicted in 8,000 years. And even something that small is just for me a reminder. You don't know when God's going to show up. And they're looking at me like, you are a genius. And they all know I barely know how to fish. It was hilarious. We about laughed ourselves to a point where I almost lost the fish. I didn't, but nonetheless, that kind of moment, as I look back over a whole year and go, oh my gosh, I need the reminder again that God shows up, even in the midst of a pandemic, even in the midst of a polarized election. And can he show himself through a freaking fish? Apparently, for somebody as mature as me, yes.
So, when you say that, I'm like, okay, let me get in my body a little bit. I actually have so many. I won't go into any of them, but I would say like pepperoni pizza, pizza night, and donut Saturday, and pizza Friday, pizza night, and movie night, and donut Saturday were thrilling to me this year. Those rhythms. And the loons that I heard in Maine when Michael and I took a very safe, COVID safe trip to Maine to a cabin that friends own and stayed on a lake. And I heard loons for the first time. And I thought, how have I never heard loons before? So yes, I agree with you. Those moments that we need to be reminded that like Jesus is still capable of delighting our hearts and that there is beauty even in the midst of profound brokenness, that reminds us we're meant for love. So I'm with you.
Yeah,
I'm not that mature.
Right,
I'm with
right.
you.
I caught a lot of fish on this trip, and I can remember almost all of them. I remember even more the ones I failed to catch. But that moment, literally throwing this fly out, sitting down, conversation, our hearts just need surprise to have something of a grasp of who Jesus is. So, Rachel, what do you take from this year into the next, and in one sense beyond, that will shape something of how you live?
Oh man, so many things, but two things that come to mind. One, I will never, I probably will because our memories are short, but I hope that I never again take for granted being in the physical proximity of the people I love, my family, my friends in Seattle who I thought I would be seeing you every other month and traveling back and forth when I agreed to move to Philadelphia. So that's one thing. I think in some ways having to contend with the entitlement I've had in feeling like that's just a given. So there's something of that. I also think this year has invited all of us to slow down and to simplify, right? I mean, we're out of demand. And there's something of that I really do want to take into this next year, no matter how the world shifts, that there's something good about not having so many activities, so many distractions, so much go, 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 go. Like, I don't know if I'll travel at the same capacity, even if it's available to me, as I was when it was kind of like, this is just normal rhythm of life. So there's something about slowing down that I will take with me. Yeah.
Can I just say ditto, ditto? Oh, it's so well said. I think the only thing I'll add is, especially as I age, this notion of this is the last year of my life. 2021 is the last year of my life. How do I go into this year, come from this year, go into this next year and say, you can't predict whether you're going to be alive or not, whether you're going to be taken out by a pandemic or not. So what are you doing that you really would be doing if you knew you only had 1 year left? And so I think there is something very righteous about that question. You got 1 year left in life. What are you going to do with it? Now, my hope is I have many years left, but to operate in one sense from this crazy, unpredictable, tragic year, and to be able to say, did I do what I am most meant to do, what I want to do? And in some ways, what I would say is the work we've done in the Allender Center, the work we've done in creating new leadership structures in the Allender Center, focusing on what our real meaning and unique place in the kingdom of God is. That work is not finished by any stretch, but I look back to this year and say, I have seen the goodness of God in the land of the living. And I don't end this year with despair. I end it with heartache. I end it with anger, but I end it with a taste of, even here, our God has been good. So as we end, I'll just say to you, my friend, what a privilege to be a co-host with you. And I look forward even for a few more days until we do our next new year. So I'll say, may this year end well for you, Michael, and the boys, and look forward to beginning again next year.
Indeed. And I would send those blessings back to you and Becky and your family in this season, and just really grateful to get to join you in this way, and send blessings to everyone as we come to a close of this year.
Well, I think we can say without question, this has been a year like no other year. And the level of trauma we have seen in the midst of, all sorts of crises. We've got a year ahead that in some ways is going to be where the effects of trauma are actually being played out in people's lives in a far more dramatic way. And as much as we have seen the goodness of God, we know that our labor ahead is going to be even more complex and, frankly, even more demanding.
It really has been tremendous in the midst of such an uncharted, unprecedented time to see the provision of God, because honestly, in a year where we thought maybe we would struggle to get people to our trainings, we've had bigger waiting lists. We've had more people opting in, and I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. So we know not only do we have tremendous work ahead, but that we want to be able to equip as many people as possible, because it really does feel like one of those seasons where the harvest is going to be really plentiful, but the workers are few. So however you might be able to partner with us and join us as we lean into the year ahead and really try to steward well the resources we've been given, the calling we've been given, and the tremendous people who have come alongside of us to live out this calling. So if you feel compelled to partner with us and give, you can go to theallendercenter.org/give. The Allender Center podcast is produced by the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology.
If you'd like more information about the Allender Center, you can look at theallendercenter.org.